Thank you very much for the invitation to come here. It's my first time in Belfast and in Northern Ireland. I've taken the liberty to change the title. I'll call it MECFS, Are We Closing In on the Disease Mechanisms, and Is Better Treatment Soon Available? I felt that I've talked so much about rituximab that I would talk about something else in addition now. And it's a bit strange being an oncologist trained in radiation oncology and medical oncology and standing talking about a totally different disease, but it illustrates the problem with ME because no one really knows what it is. There's no defined medical specialty that has been given the responsibility to find out what to do with these patients. So I'm an oncologist, there are immunologists, there are general practitioners, everyone is involved if you get the interest. And you have to just grip the opportunity when you get it, as we did. Because we came into this area through the back door. We came into the area because we had a patient with lymphoma, which we treated with 4 different chemotherapy regimens. After one and only one of those 4 regimens, the patient experienced that her ME, which she had had for 6 or 7 years, suddenly started to improve. It was like it started overnight. About 7 weeks into her chemotherapy course, and she had effect lasting about 5 months, and then gradually her symptoms came back. But the recovery was remarkable. She was a wheelchair user, and she was socially out of society, and she took up her old hobbies and physically was quite able for that 5-month period. Well, the disease came back, and Dr. Fluge, my colleague, was seeing her at the outpatient department, and I was a year in the US, in fact, and we met around a table in Chicago, and he said, I wonder about this patient, what really happened to her? And we started discussing, and I was going back in a few months, and we said, when I come back, we'll find out what to do. And we did. We did, in fact, sit down and reason. We did not do what this press states, that we coincidentally treated a patient with lymphoma and with rituximab and she had effect. It was in fact a mental exercise to find a drug that we could use that possibly could give the same kind of effect, because we thought that the drug combination that she had probably had an effect on the immune system in a special way, probably a relative B lymphocyte depletion. So we knew that from oncology that we had a drug that specifically could do that, deplete the B lymphocytes. And we gave her one single drug dose. We know that the B cells, they vanish from blood within a week. Nothing happened to the patient, but suddenly 7 weeks after we gave the dose, she calls Dr. Fluge and said, I think something's happening. I'm not quite sure. And 2 days later she calls back, exactly the same thing is happening to me now as when I was getting cancer chemotherapy and recovered. And she had a good response. We'll come back to that. But after this patient, we treated 2 more patients and both had response. And then we went on to a small double-blind rituximab study, which we'll come back to. And later a phase 2 study to try to exploit how to use this drug in a more optimal way. The first studies were just to see is there a response or is there not a response. This phase 2 study was done in preparation for a larger phase 3 study if we could still find this drug promising. And now we're in a phase 3 study, a double-blind, placebo-controlled, multi-center study within 5 centers in different parts of Norway. I think that are we going to make progress in disease, we have to understand more the disease mechanisms. And we know that there are some clues in the disease itself. About 70% of ME patients have a preceding infection or other immune stimulation. For example, vaccinations. We have some patients quite certainly have a trigger through a vaccination. Other trauma, like a big physical incident, for example, a traffic accident or a big operation, or also a mental issue, a mental trauma, for example. Every one of those, they change the immune system for some time. It's an immune challenge. Maybe that is the common factor, that it is the immune system that is the problem. And from what we've seen trying to change the immune system with rituximab, we believe that is the key. We do not see that most of our patients have immune deficiencies. On the contrary, most of our patients, they seem to be hyperimmune. Although we see patients that get a lot of infections, the more common one is that they don't get anything. The relatives are sick, they do not get infections. In fact, when we have treated patients and they get better from their ME, they often get their normal infections back. It's a bit interesting. For example, also allergies. I remember one particular patient I've treated, she had a good response to rituximab. She had a lot of allergy problems before she got ME. Allergy was practically gone when she got ME. And when she recovered from rituximab, her allergy came back. So we did not cure her allergy, but her ME was much improved. We have seen response to B cell depletion, that is taking away the B lymphocytes, which you know, among other things, have the responsibility of making antibodies. But we also see effects of more broadly acting immune manipulation. But not all immune manipulations work. And some people say that since they don't respond to steroids, it can't be an immune disease. Well, that is very wrong. And also, for example, we have treated patients with TNF alpha receptor etanercept. It does not work in our hands. So all kinds of immune manipulations do not work. Nevertheless, rituximab, and also in some patients, gamma globulin, probably some of you have experience with that, and the American experience, that Ampligen, they in fact do work for some patients, and that does indicate that there is involvement of the immune system in the disease pathomechanism. Again, I think we have to understand the disease mechanisms, and one of the questions we have to ask is there one mechanism, or are there several ending up in the same common clinical presentation? What we have seen in our studies is that we have a high incidence of autoimmune disease in the families of patients with ME in general, about 40% or above that among first-degree relatives in our studies. And we also know from population studies that there is a genetic predisposition. That doesn't mean that everyone with ME has a person with ME in the family, but the chances of having another person with ME, if you yourself have ME, is greater than in your neighboring family without ME. And quite common, we see more than one individual in a family. Mother, daughter, mother, two daughters. It's quite common to see. And it's always on one side of the family, from the mother's side or the father's side. We heard Dr. Weir's talking about women being more often affected than males, 3 to 4 women per male. And is that uncommon if this, for example, is an autoimmune disease? Now we know that from rheumatoid arthritis up to myasthenia gravis, the sex numbers are 2 to 3 to 9 to 1. I mean, 9 times as common myasthenia in women as in men. Interesting aspect also is that in children before puberty, our pediatricians in our hospital say that it's just as common for males to get this disease than girls. But after puberty, we see this change 3 to 4 times as often in girls as in boys. And how can this be? Well, you must remember that the immune system is totally different in women than in men. They are made to, they are equipped to get children. And they can't have the same immune system if they're going to have an individual in their bodies for 9 months as a man would have. 70% have a sudden start, but there are also other immunological triggers, as I've said. And there's also overlap with some other syndromes that we have good evidence can be autoimmune. For example, POTS, postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome. A couple of years ago, there are good evidence that auto-antibodies are involved in this disease. When we started looking at these patients, and we were not acquainted with this patient group before we saw our first patient, but what struck us, both Dr. Fluger and me, was that they were so remarkably similar, with the same type of symptoms, but with different degrees of severity among the different symptoms. But the symptoms, they came from multiple body systems, the skeletal muscle, the heart, the brain. We saw sensory amplification of all types of symptoms, from pain to light, sound, etc. Gastrointestinal tract symptoms are very common. Symptoms from the autonomous nerve system, ocular symptoms, immune system symptoms. Yet there was no apparent connection that could explain what was going on. We sat many conversations late in the evening in the office, trying to stimulate each other, Dr. Fluger and I, trying to understand what this could mean. But of course, it could be a subcellular system that was dispersed within the body. And later we have evidence that that can be the case. And one thing that helps us enormously is that when we do clinical trials, we get a biobank. We can take blood tests from the patients before start and during the treatment, and we can have also healthy sex match controls, and we can see what happens with the blood test in patients responding and recurring. And our biobank has come to help also other research groups. We have autoantibody screening cooperation with Berlin, peptide array immunoreactivity studies with Canada and USA, immunophenotyping of lymphocyte subsets, Dr. Cambridge in London. Cytokines we've done a lot about. I think cytokines are difficult because they fluctuate so much during the day. We will find something in cytokines, but they are very far down the line from where things happen. Immunogenetic analysis is done by cooperators in Oslo, DNA sequencing, and we're looking for typical genes that are seen in other autoimmune diseases. And we have some data which is very interesting, not published yet. We ourselves are looking at families with a high occurrence of ME/CFS, doing exome sequencing. That is looking at the part of the genome that expresses we look at 30,000 genes. It's quite a job. But we have looked at 2 families extensively, families with ME in 3 generations. And we're looking at a 3rd family. And we've also done a limited look at a smaller family, just in 1 generation. We're finding interesting things. They're not published yet, but they tell us that there are genetic dispositions for this disease in some families, especially in those families where we see a very high occurrence. For example, 3 children under the age of 10. It's very easy to amount social security workers saying there has to be something wrong with this family. But we can show that, yes, there's something wrong with the family, but it's in the genes, not in the way the family functions. And we are doing metabolomic studies. We've published something around that as I'll come back to. We're especially doing cooperation here within Bergen with other groups within the university hospital and the university. And going on with metabolomics, Dr. Navio from the US published just a few days before we sent in our paper what he called a hypometabolic state in ME patients, where he found changes in fatty substances, phingolipids, phospholipids, purines, vitamins B2, and branched amino acids in ME/CFS, and also in fatty acids in female patients. And later that year, also a Japanese paper came out indicating that there were reduced levels of function in the TCA cycle, suggesting TCA dysfunction. TCA is the mode of degrading glucose to energy. And this cycle has to function if we are to make the amount of the energy coin in the body, ATP, which we need all the time. You can say, for example, muscles, there's very little storage within the muscles. So when the muscle needs ATP, it can take up the building of ATP 70 to 100 times. And of course, if that can't function, you will very quickly get problems with your muscles if you're, for example, running. So we published around New Year in Journal of Clinical Investigation Insight, where we looked at the patterns of degradation of the 20 common amino acids in our trial patients. These are well-characterized patients, and we take the blood tests from them and look at what happens to the amino acids. And we see there a pattern that indicates an inhibition in the production of energy, the energy coin, that all cells need ATP. When more energy is needed, stores are quickly used up, and we cannot produce enough ATP if this system is not functioning well. And the cells struggle to produce ATP, and they use the available but insufficient route. And that's the route that Dr. Weir talked about recently. When you don't have enough oxygen, you can make 2 molecules of ATP instead of over 30 during the normal route. And you can do that for a very short period, and then it doesn't work. So he can, his 10,000 meter runner can do it maybe 200 meters. If you start doing that after 5,000 meters, you have no chance to fulfill your 10,000 meter race. And here is how it looks. Up to the left there, the nutrients, glucose, come into the cell. They are degraded to pyruvate in the cytosol, and then within the mitochondria, they are to be degraded through the pyruvate dehydrogenase complex. It's an enzyme complex, quite it's complex in itself. And then the products go further through the TCA cycle and eventually ends up in the oxidative phosphorylation, also within the mitochondrion. This is the route, the normal route for glucose. It is also possible to make energy out of amino acids, fatty acids, and ketone bodies, as shown. What we found, and we looked at the simplest type of cell, is of course white blood cells. They can easily be accessible, and we found through the pattern of the amino acids that there is a relative loss of some types of amino acids while others are intact. And if we look a bit closer to this, we find that the amino acids, the red ones that can be converted to pyruvate, they have a normal level, while those that can be used as a replenishment of TCA intermediates to maintain the TCA cycle capacity, they are reduced. Also, the amino acids that can be catabolized to acetyl coenzyme A, which is the first step in the TCA cycle, they're reduced in level. Now, what does this tell us? Well, it tells us there's something wrong between pyruvate and acetyl coenzyme A. And what is there? Well, it's the PDH complex. The PGA complex is slowed down, and we've looked at the enzymes that regulate this, and we find that the kinases are they have a higher level than they should. Their activity is higher than they should. and that inhibits the PDH complex. So this is an indication that there's something wrong with the PDH functioning. And now we see here to the left is how glucose alternatively can be degraded. It can be go over to pyruvate, and then it can produce lactate, which is the way it is done when the cells have very little oxygen. This is a kind of escape mechanism that is used in very special situations for survival, mainly, and it can be done in an athlete running 10,000 meters when his last 100, 200 meters is left, where you have to use all your resources. We can measure this in vitro by taking the cells and letting them grow in a dish, and we can look at the products that the cells produce when we give them different substances to work on. And we can see from the next slide what we did, and that was also in this publication around New Year. We took patient serum, we took from some of the patients with more severe disease, and we took from healthy controls, and we took normal muscle cells, grew them in dishes, and then we exposed the normal muscle cells for patient serum and from healthy patient, healthy person serum. And then we measured their rate of oxygen consumption and the rate of production of lactate. And what did we see? We saw that the muscle cells behaved differently if they were given serum for the patient or serum from healthy people. And in fact, serum from patients increased the oxygen consumption rate, which is something maybe it's not intuitive considering ME as a disease, but we believe this is a compensation mechanism. We also have to know that these are normal muscle cells. They have no genetic defects or anything in them. And we also saw that under stress, these cells exposed to serum from patients, they had an excess production of lactate. And last year I was making a speech, and before this publication I said at a talk that ME-CFS is not in the blood, is in the blood, not between the ears. And I didn't know that in the audience there was someone streaming my talk, and the next day this was on a website in the US with a poor Google Translate. A lot of misunderstandings, but that's how the world works today. You can't say anything and not letting it be public. Well, this is no surprise for the patients. The patients know that the disease is not between the ears. It's a real disease. But the health professionals and the public have to understand it. And we're trying to accumulate evidence to show that this is true. And presently we're trying to more directly measure the PDH function. And if we can do that, and not only indirectly by looking at the amino acids, it'll be a good step forward. The lack of ATP will particularly be noticeable in tissues that need quick and big changes. For example, skeletal muscle and the heart and the brain. Because their dominating use of energy comes from glucose, and they have to change a lot the amount of ATP that they need from second to second. For example, the brain, I don't know if you know it, but 30% of all glucose utilization when we are resting is done in the brain. So when an ME patient gets a lot of stimuli, they often tell that in fact they feel they are lactic in their muscles. Well, that can be true because the brain is preferred, and it makes sense in fact to me. The hypothesis of metabolic obstruction in the central energetic pathway, the PDH complex, may explain two features that almost all patients that we meet describe. a profound and devastating lack of energy. In fact, they don't have energy. They don't have more ATP than they need. And also the excessive lactate production from very limited exercise. For example, patients standing for a POTS test in our study, and they tell us after 4 or 5 minutes that now I feel that lactate is accumulating from my ankles and coming up to my waist. And if you take a blood test, their lactate level is 4 times as high as it should be. And that's not normal. Patients who can do some more, have a bit more ability, not so profoundly ill, walk 2 stairs up, and you take a blood test, you can find the same thing with a bit more exertion. So to us, it seems that the metabolic patterns that we see seems to tell us that ME/CFS is like a struggle for energy going on in the patients. Another issue I will go on to is also probably related to the mitochondrial problem. There was a report from Dundee in 2012 that ME/CFS patients have problems with arterial blood flow regulation. And we have measured also flow-mediated dilatation of arteries and pore, which is an indication of the regulation ability in the small arteries, while the FMD is usually done in the brachial artery in the arm. And this is an indication that the patients have endothelial dysfunction. That is something that's quite common in other diseases, for example, in diabetes type 2 and in hypertension. And what is wrong is that the endothelial cells, the cells on the inside of the arteries, they are to sense when there's more blood is needed. And they have an enzyme called enos, which makes nitric oxide, which is a gas which lasts from seconds to up to half a minute before it's completely degraded. That means it has to be made all the time. And if you don't have this, you have the lack of ability to dilate the arteries. So what you in fact do in these tests is that you clamp a patient's arm for 5 minutes, open up. That's a stimulus to dilate your brachial artery. And you measure with ultrasound the rate of dilatation within the first minute after you open up the clamping. And it shows that this is not functioning well in our patients, and this is unpublished data. To the left there you see healthy controls is the right panel. That is their FMD levels. The middle is the ME patients in the Hope4ME trial done in Bergen. And the ones to the left are other ME patients that we've been treating in other studies. So what we see is there's a very significantly much lower FMD, looking at the group as a whole, in ME patients compared to healthy controls. And what does this tell us? Well, it tells us that there's something wrong with the ability to produce nitric oxide in these patients. Also, to the right there, when we look at the pore, that is looking in the hand at the smaller arteries, we see just the same, that the patients from Bergen Hope4ME baselines compared to healthy controls is different, significantly different. And so what if you lack nitric oxide? What does that do to you? Well, nitric oxide is a transmitter substance. It affects smooth muscle in general. And there is a link between AMPK, which Dr. Weir talked about this afternoon, the energy sensitizing enzyme, and nitric oxide. And what does, apart from not getting enough blood to your arteries when you, or your muscle, for example, when you need it, what else can a lack of nitric oxide mean? Well, it increases smooth muscle tone, not only in the artery wall, but in the gastrointestinal tractus. It can give enhanced neurotransmission. Possibly this could be a part of the explanation for sensory hypersensitivity, including pain. It can affect the function of immune cells, and it can also have a meaning in regulation of endocrine function. We know that that can also be a problem in ME patients. This hasn't been proven, but it is a possibility. So our present hypothesis concerning this disease is that there's an immune dysfunction which is induced, and that can be done probably in several ways, and it results in a mitochondrial defect. And that again results in lack of ATP when we need it, and the patients need it. And we get widespread symptoms from multiple systems, but also when these things happen, also compensatory mechanisms start happening. For example, the autonomous nerve system cannot just watch the body not functioning. What can happen can be, for example, sympathetic activation. The problem with MA, I think, is that when you really start looking at it, you find so much things that are wrong. When you go to subcellular levels, it's hard to find out what is the prime event and what is happening very far down the line as a result of this and that. And all our genes can affect the end result in different organ systems. But there is one argument that there is one primary target, and that is our rituximab studies, because what we regularly see when patients start responding to treatment, they start responding in all types of symptoms at the same time. Not to the same extent, but we have never seen a patient that only has half of the symptoms gone. They usually respond in all symptoms at the same time, but maybe to different extents. Then we go back to where it started. We had this initial lymphoma patient who responded to rituximab, one single infusion, and two other patients. We published them all. They had response, but this was just single infusions, and it was just to tell the world that we had observed something. But of course, we were an oncology department, and it wasn't really natural for us to work on ME. But on the other hand, we thought that maybe we had seen something that could be important for ME patients. So we decided that we would do a small placebo-controlled study just to see if this was coincidental or if it really was something. So we did it. No one knew about it at the time, so we could do it in peace. And we published it in 2011, and there was a lot of arousal, I must say, after that. We did a small study, 30 patients. It was the Fukuda criteria that we used for recruitment, but 28 of these 30 also fulfilled the Canadian criteria. The primary endpoint in this study was negative, because at the time we made the study, we only had seen 2 patients, in fact, and those 2 patients were the exception. They had early responses. So we chose 3 months, the fatigue at 3 months as the primary endpoint. And as you see in the figure out to the right, between 0 and 16 weeks, there is no difference between the red dots and the black dots. Each dot is an indication where the patients score themselves compared to how they were when they started the study. But later you see that there's a separation between the reds and the blacks. And that was a significant difference in the course of how these patients fared during the 12-month observation periods. They were given 2 single drugs, 2 single infusions at 0 and 14 days, and then observed for 12 months. Looking at response, 10 of the 15 patients in the intervention group had a response, and 2 of 15 in the placebo group had a response. But what we also saw was that the responses were transient. 2 of the patients in this study that had rituximab are still, in fact, have got their disease back, but most of them had response lasting a few months, and then they gradually got their disease back. So one thing to think of was, how can we do this better? And the top bar here says R is the time when the patient gets rituximab. This is one of our pilot patients. She had 20 weeks lag time before she got response. She had a response which lasted, according to our criteria, for 14 weeks. She was back to where she started. She got a new rituximab treatment. Again, 20 weeks. The same thing happened after 20 weeks. She had a response. And the duration of response was, in fact, just the same, 14 weeks. And what about giving rituximab as a maintenance treatment? Could we see the bars below if we gave rituximab more frequently? And that was the idea behind the phase 2 study, which we treated 29 patients with. We saw 62% of these patients having a clinically significant response, and 38 who had no significant response to treatment. And these patients were followed for 3 years. 11 of the 18 were still in response at 3 years. While after 3 years, we have had some more recurrences, so recurrences can happen, also late. 4 or 5 of these patients are still well. We have never seen a patient with an immediate response to rituximab. There's always a lag time before this response comes. And we believe this says something about the disease mechanisms. It is easiest compatible with something being in the blood of the patients that has to be naturally degraded. And then when the level is come to a certain level, the patients experience response. These patients in this study, they had a mean lag time within the a mean response time of 97 weeks within the 3 years observation period. And the person with the earliest recurrence after treatment, that happened 11 months after the last infusion of rituximab. These patients were, according to protocol, given rituximab up to 14 months, but some patients were also given up, according to amendment in the protocol, up to 24 months. So what we concluded from this study was that maintenance treatment increased duration of response. In the meantime, we had another study going for patients with severe and very severe ME, and we had to abrupt that because it was really difficult to get these patients to hospital and treat them within a hospital ward in oncology, where you cannot take care of them in the same way as you should do. And also we must say that for the very severely sick patients, we did not see that type of responses as we did in the more normal ME patients. Back again to this phase 2 study. Here is their recording. 3 is the symptoms they had, the feeling of fatigue they had when they went into the study, while 6 is a very good response, 5 is a moderate response, 4 is a slight response. And we see that almost all the patients are above the starting point at the end of the study. What about quality of life? If we look at the top figure, the red is the good responding patients. We see that physical function, which is one of the subdimensions in the SF36 scheme, which is very well known from life quality studies, the patients are doing very well, in fact very much near the normal of the population, while the slighter moderate responders had lower levels improvement, while the patients without response to the right, the blue ones, are at the same level as they were. Vitality is just the same. The next one out to the right, the patients are doing well. Bodily pain down to the left, social function in the middle bottom, while the only subdimension that did not change was in fact mental health. In fact, the patients aren't really mentally sick. That's why they are like that. They were the same level before and after. What about tolerance? We had 2 patients with allergic reactions. One of them, in fact, just got 1 infusion, couldn't have any more because he got a lung reaction. This is quite uncommon, but therefore we only treated 28 of the 29 patients during the rest of the study. 2 patients had what we call late onset neutropenia, which is something we know very well from oncology. It lasts 4 to 5 days. It has to do with the maturation of the so-called granulocytes, a type of white blood cells. It can give a serious infection, but once you know about it, it's no problem. You can give antibiotics in a hospital a few days and the patient recovers. What you should note is that 8 of the 28 patients had a transient symptom worsening after rituximab infusion. Usually it was days, weeks, but in a few cases it can last longer. And how can this be? Well, remember that rituximab is not a symptomatic drug. It is an immune stimulus. You give a patient an immunoglobulin, and if you don't have an effect of the drug which counteracts this, you can in fact get an accentuation of the ME symptoms. And this is a potential problem in the ongoing Hope4ME study. One of the 28 patients had sustained worsening, but we don't know, of course, if this had to do with the natural cause of the disease or if it had to do with the drug. But the question is raised, we have to do clinical studies to know how safe this drug is. Many people who are not used to rituximab, they say that rituximab is very dangerous. You know, in the hands of an oncologist, this is a very tolerant drug. It is very well tolerated. Except for allergy, we see very little problems with it. But there are potential problems if you, for example, have a patient with an ongoing infection. It could pose problems. Now, if we're going to on and try to find a way to get an indication for drug, you have to do so-called phase 3 studies. You have to test the possible new treatment against the best established or existing standard treatment. As there is no standard drug treatment or any known placebo effect, but there can be a placebo effect, the standard treatment arm has to be placebo according to our thoughts. And also it's good to do a multi-center study because that reduces selection bias. It could be that we unconsciously select special patients that prove to be easier to get to respond to rituximab if we do it in one center. But here we have written selection criteria, and the patients are locally recruited at the 5 centers that we are doing our Hope4ME trial in. There has to be compromises in trials. Also in our phase 3 trial, the number of patients, the doses, duration of treatment, the costs are a major issue. Of course, if we had 1,000 ME patients, I'm very sure that we would get a positive trial, but we can't do that. I mean, our study costs about £1.5 million. It's quite a costly thing because you have to have people working in 5 different centers. Just paying them 3 years' salary costs quite a lot of money. The drugs, about a third of the cost. So there are compromises that can pose us problems when we look into what this study gives us. And this is the schedule. 152 patients, 5 centers, 4 of them university clinics. We give rituximab in the same dose as we have done previously, 500 milligrams per square, max dose 1000 milligrams at 0 and 14 days. And then we give maintenance treatment in 3, 6, 9 and 12 months. Here we give 500 milligrams as a fixed dose. And here I will note that we are given a lower dose as maintenance than we have done in the previous study. That can pose a problem. Maybe the dose can be too low. That can, for example, indicate that patients get faster recurrence, possibly. But as I said, we have to do compromises. Taking down the dose to 500 milligrams takes down the cost of drug about 50%. Placebo with albumin is the placebo. Why albumin? Well, it must be indistinguishable for those handling the patients. They can't see what you're giving the patient. It has to look just the same. So that's why we do that. And it's a double-blind design. We've been treating patients since September 2014, and in October 2017, the last patient will have been observed for 24 months. And that is the point where we have to lock all the data, and we go to the commercial company that has the code and ask for the code, and then we do the analysis. It's a disease with few objective measures, and self-reporting is essential for us. The patient is the one that really feels what this disease is doing. And we do retrospective reporting every 2 weeks. The patients are asked to tell how the different symptoms change from what they experienced before going into the study. That's always the reference. How does it change during these 24 months? The primary endpoints have to be chosen before the study is started, and we've chosen the development of self-reported fatigue over the 24 months and the number of patients in clinical response according to given criteria as the primary endpoints. As secondary endpoints, we look at functional level, where the patients are asked to estimate their functional level according to a scale. And we look at changes in quality of life, SF36 and FFS schemes. And we also have an objective measure, sense-aware activity registration. 7 days of activity registration where the patients have an electronic device which tells what happens during 24 hours. It gives us quite a lot of interesting data, in fact. And of course, toxicity always has to be an endpoint. The sense where we look at baseline and what happens with the patient at 18 months. And we also have some sub-studies. And that is not done at all the 5 institutions because it's dependent on the local expertise. We look at endothelial function in both Notodden and Bergen. We have cardiopulmonary exercise tests in 3 other centers. And only in Bergen we look at gastrointestinal function together with our gastro doctors. And we also have external monitors. That is people that are not involved in the trial. They go around and look at how the data is accumulated and see that this is functioning well. And also I would say, when we're hearing Tulla talking this afternoon about the PACE study, this of course will be open to review for all official bodies. Always the Norwegian governmental bodies, but of course also FDA or others, if they find interest in it. Biobank sampling is very important for us, and we try to do this as well as possible to understand the disease mechanisms. We're not only doing rituximab, we're in fact also doing another immune treatment using an old drug. Some of the doctors in the audience will nod and say, I've heard about that. Yes, we've had it around for 50 years, more than that. And the reason for interest in this is that we had 2 mammary carcinoma patients that had ME and in fact had bettering of their symptoms, one of them very dramatically. And then later we had a 3rd patient. We reasoned that in their 3-drug combination, cyclophosphamide was the most probable drug to affect the disease because it was the one that has the greatest activity on the immune system. Cyclo is a very interesting drug because depending on doses, it can give immunosuppression and it can do just the opposite also. We treated 3 pilot patients with only cyclophosphamide and 2 of the 3 responded, and therefore we went on and we have done a 40-patient study. 15 patients are previously rituximab treated with recurrence or without response to rituximab, and 25 are drug naive. We have 18 months observation time. We have a 2-center study, Bergen and our oncology colleagues in Oslo. Canadian criteria, mild to moderate up to severe, more than 2 years duration. And we gave 1 infusion every 4 weeks, 6 times, and then observe the patients and use the same endpoints as in the Hope4ME study. And the study is still ongoing. This summer, the last patient will have been through the 18 months. But we can already say that also cyclophosphamide can attenuate ME/CFS symptoms. We are without doubt in that. On the other hand, it gives more subjective toxicity, especially nausea and accentuation of the ME symptoms. The subjective toxicity is greater in ME patients than in cancer patients, where this drug is very well tolerated. On the other hand, we have not experienced serious toxicity. So the good message is that also a broader acting immune drug can affect ME symptoms. So in the future, it doesn't have to be rituximab, it could be something else. That could be the ideal. I'm not saying that cyclophosphamide is the ideal, but presently we are starting up with a part B of this study, which we've also got ethical approval for, and that is that we space the rituximab. No, we space the cyclophosphamide 6 weeks instead of 4 weeks, and see if that can give better tolerance for the patients. Still have a few minutes, but I'm getting to the end. If autoantibodies, which we believe many patients probably have, to explain how responses are seen in rituximab, they can be reproduced by B cells of different maturation. We know that plasma cells usually are the cells that they are the mature B cells. They're usually the cells that make most of the antibodies. But we know that in autoimmune diseases, the autoantibodies are often made by a bit earlier pre-plasma cells, for example. The problem with plasma cells is they do not have CD20 on their membranes, so they're not attacked by rituximab. That is, if you have a disease where your autoantibodies are produced by plasma cells, you probably will not ever have response to rituximab. And I think we also have to learn from rheumatology. Responding to a drug one time doesn't mean you always will respond in the future, because you can have a transmission of production from the early plasma cells to the later plasma cells, and that can give you resistance. We really don't know if the disease mechanism is the same in all ME patients, or if only the reaction from the effector system is similar. I think I'll skip that one. It's a bit heavy, but it says something about how we think the immune manipulation affects the PDH complex, and the enzymes that we have shown are increased and which affect the PDH complex. So how does the future look? I think we have learned very much in the last few years. We're beginning to understand what is wrong, and that will boost much more research. And I think the interest from the pharmaceutical industry will rise abruptly. And that is important to get drug development. I believe that there may be different triggers on top of a genetic predisposition, but the effector system for the symptoms probably are common. But the key to treat the underlying cause even better will be to modify the immune system. But I think also that symptomatic treatment can attenuate the disease symptoms, even without treating the cause. For example, supplements may in the future help patients even though the underlying cause is not being treated. We are looking now at what is around the TCA cycle, the vitamins, the B vitamins, beta-in, choline, etc. And we also find there are problems there. It's quite possible that giving supplements, patients can get better from that also. I think we're making progress in treatment. And even if the Hope4ME study should be negative, because there are many examples of negative phase 3 studies in medicine, after encouraging phase 2 studies. I think we've learned a lot from the study, and not the least, our biobank is very important there. And I'll greet you with our research group. It seems that we have a lot of people. Most of these are working 1 or 2 or 3% of their time. We have 3 people full-time, and the others are working part-time. In the middle, together with me, is Øystein Fluge, my colleague and collaborator. And luckily, he fell down from his roof 8 days ago. And luckily, he survived, but it was a real trauma. He got a spleen rupture and went into shock. So he's not coming to London. But our fellow will do his presentation. And we also have to thank the Kavli Trust, which has been our lifeline and which has helped us to come where we are. In the Rituximase study, as I told you, it's an expensive study. We've got a lot of support. The Norwegian Research Council, we got in competition with very many other research groups, not within ME, but all kinds of research. The Me&You Foundation, private fundraising, Norwegian ME Association, and the regional health trusts in Norway are the reason for us being able to do this study. So thank you.
So this is who I am. Until June 30th, I have a position at Berkeley, and after June 30th, I probably do, but it's not quite clear. The University of California at the moment is a financial basket case, and the state keeps cutting funding, and so my position, which is a year-to-year appointment, is ending soon, so that's who I am. This is the next one. Okay. So one thing I'm doing is to help with this. I'm going to talk about the PACE trial, but this is I've been doing my work on Virology blog, which is a blog. Oh, I switched this around, but okay, this is the previous version of my thing, but that's okay. So Virology blog is run by a colleague of mine, Vincent Racaniello. He's a Columbia University professor of. He's a virologist, and so he's been very interested in ME for a number of years, and so when I started investigating the PACE trial a couple of years ago, I've used his site to do my work, and now I'm doing a crowdfunding to support my continued blogging and investigation of the PACE trial and other issues related to ME/CFS, so I can continue the work. Because I've been doing this mainly as a public service, because I've had a paid position at Berkeley that I managed to spend a lot of time on this on my own, and so now I'm going further. So. I got involved with the PACE trial a couple of years ago. I had been reporting about ME/CFS, not a lot over the last 10 years, but when there was idea that there was retroviral implication, the XMRV virus, mouse retrovirus that was looked at about 6 years ago, a friend of mine, I got into this not because I have a family member, but because a friend of mine's been sick for a long time. And he said, David, you should write something about these studies and what's going on. And at that time, I was doing a lot of work for the New York Times. So I did about a dozen stories on this XMRV situation. And during that, the PACE trial came out. So the PACE trial, basically, in brief, was a £5 million trial in the UK funded by government agencies, basically designed to prove what they were already doing, which is designed to prove essentially that graded exercise therapy and cognitive behavior therapy work. So it was the definitive treatment. It was promoted as the definitive treatment. And these were the two therapies that the PACE investigators had been promoting for the last 15 years since 1990 or 1991, based on their completely unproven theory that the only thing wrong with people is that they're deconditioned. And the reason they're deconditioned is because they have a false ideation or a false cognitive belief that they actually have an illness called ME. And the reason they have this false ideation is because there's a community of activists out there telling them that they have ME and telling them that the thing that they shouldn't do is exercise. So these people have the false notion that they can't exercise, and so they stay in bed and they become completely deconditioned. Therefore, the only two treatments that will work are graded exercise therapy, so you're ramping up your exercise, and as Dr. Weir talked about, going through the burn. You're not supposed to stop when you have symptoms, because the symptoms that come are just the symptoms that come from deconditioning. You're deconditioned, so of course if you exercise, you're going to feel bad. So you keep exercising. As we know from what we've heard, that can make people much worse, and has, many people. The other thing is cognitive behavior therapy, which in normal circumstances is perfectly appropriate for people with a major illness. The point of cognitive behavior therapy is supposed to be to help you adapt to your circumstances and manage your life as best you can, and to recognize what you can change and what you can't. The point of cognitive behavior therapy is not supposed to be to alleviate you of the false belief that you actually have an illness when you do have an illness, which is what the PACE formulated cognitive behavior therapy is. So one of their things is like, why is everybody so upset about our modest recommendations of a little exercise and a little cognitive behavior therapy? It's not even a big deal. Well, the reason is one can make you much worse, and the other one is completely ridiculous based on nonsense. And so the whole trial is completely absurd. It's just nonsense. So I've called it much worse. So when I started looking at it, I'm not an epidemiologist, I'm a social scientist. So I have a doctorate in public health from Berkeley, but I'm really a fake academic because most of my life I've been a journalist. I'm 60 years old, I got my doctorate 3 years ago. So, at the time when everybody's retiring already. So I'm not really an academic, I'm really a journalist. And so I've come to this campaign or this effort mainly as a journalist, but I've been able to use my academic credibility, such as it is, and my contacts in the academic world to raise it, I think, to a level of attention that the patients, even though I haven't really reported much that the patients hadn't known and reported over and over again and written letters to journals about in the appropriate way, that wasn't getting traction because they were patients and because the psychiatrists and psychologists and the PACE people could always frame them as crazy, hysterical, crazy people. Now, I've been dealing with this for 2 years, and I've been confronting these people who are saying black is white, and I say, no, white is white, and they continue to say black is white. And this is the PACE authors, the entire UK medical establishment, the Lancet, the journal editors, everybody is in on this mess. They're all implicated. And so I know for myself that I'm a healthy person, and I've been dealing with this for about 1.5 years, and it's driven me somewhat insane. I can't imagine being a patient, debilitated, trying to get treatment, trying to see doctors, and for 20 or 30 or however many years, you're confronted with people telling you black is white when you know white is white and black is black. It is insane, and I understand why the patient community has become a little bit insane, because I'm insane and I've only been dealing with it for a short while. So I didn't start taking this on until I actually vetted what I was reading in the patient responses to the trial with some of my colleagues. And so it's very, very hard, as a journalist, it's very, very hard to get scientists to say very bad things about other people's work if they're not directly implicated in it or they're not involved in an actual conflict with them. To get people to say things like this about a trial that they had nothing to do with is kind of shocking. I've never heard something at the height of clinical trial amateurism. That's a really bad thing to say about another trial. These are all terrible things to say about a trial, and I had many, many people saying these things. So I was convinced from when I started looking at it that it was what the patients were saying was true, and that what the PACE authors were saying was ridiculous. Okay. So just as an example, I wasn't going to do PowerPoint, but I had to when I saw this slide. This is Dr. Esther Crawley. She's a pediatrician in Bristol, and she runs around. She's a crony of the PACE authors, or a colleague, I should say. I should be polite. But she's a crony of the PACE authors. And she is basically doing done a lot of research on cognitive behavior therapy and graded exercise therapy in children. And now she's doing a big study on internet cognitive behavior therapy for children, and promising that 2/3 of children will be fully recovered after it, because that's what previous studies show, she claims. However, basically what I wanted to show this slide was because this is what happens to you when you challenge these people and you actually point out that what they say is bullshit. So if you notice, this is my name here, and this is one of my blog posts where I wrote about her terrible work. Now, I will say that I was rude and obnoxious and very American in doing that. I show no deference to these people because they don't deserve any of my deference or any of my respect. And I make no apologies for being loud and obnoxious because, as I've seen from patients, no matter what they say, patients have been very patient, very appropriate for the most part, and very writing, journal letters and journal articles and publishing in all the right places. However, it has not gotten any traction. Okay, so my decision was, you have to be rude with these people and get their attention that way. So I've been very rude, and I've been very rude in this blog. However, I have not been libelous. There is not one word of things untrue in that blog. You can't be libelous just because you say something bad about people. You actually have to libel people only if you're inaccurate. So, Dr. Crawley gave this presentation about the anti-science patient community harassing the PACE authors a couple of weeks ago. And this, unfortunately for her, she probably gave the same presentation 500 million times. Unfortunately for her, someone live tweeted that presentation and showed all her slides where she's insulting patients, claiming that seeking information under Freedom of Information requests is harassment. She also advised all the clinicians there about their ways to avoid their legal responsibilities, all the excuses why they can not give up information under Freedom of Information requests. And she also insulted me and libeled me by calling me libelous. And she also insulted my colleague, Vincent Racaniello, who posts virology blogs. So I've gone to town and written many, many blog posts, letters to her, demanding an explanation, demanding an apology, demanding their evidence that I libeled her, and of course their silence. And I've gotten pretty, I've very publicly tried to embarrass her. It hasn't worked too much yet. I would say that the PACE trial is a very good example of research misconduct. It's already used at Berkeley in some classes as a case study. They've done one wonderful thing for science. They've provided an amazing case study of terrible science and incredible confirmation bias. And I think it will be used in years to come in that way. That's the only thing it's good for. Well, the second thing it's good for is that it proved that their interventions do not work. That's what it proved, unlike what they said. So, these are just short versions of long things of research misconduct. This one's from the NIH. These are from various ones in the UK. All the universities and the MRC all have very similar things. So they basically violated all of these things. Other ones they didn't violate, they didn't plagiarize, they didn't do other things, but these ones they did. So I'm going to just go through a few points of how they did this. Okay, so they have no informed consent. This is kind of shocking. Again, I'm not going to do it PowerPoint. I would have highlighted things, but in the second one, it says they need to be, point number 26, if you look at any possible conflicts of interest and institutional affiliations of the researcher. Okay? So, in order to do research with human subjects, under the Declaration of Helsinki, this is the Declaration of Helsinki, which was formulated in the 50s and 60s, after Nuremberg or whatever, on how to protect human subjects of research. So, in the PACE protocol, among the ethical guidelines they promised to adhere to was the Declaration of Helsinki. The Declaration of Helsinki makes it very clear how to obtain informed consent from your participants. However, the PACE authors did not include any information about their conflicts of interest in the consent forms for the trial or the information for the trial. Now, they have very severe conflicts of interest because basically for the last 25 years, the three principal investigators on and off, and I don't know all the details of what years, but they've all acknowledged that they have close ties and financial links with disability insurance companies. In other words, they've spent the last 25 years telling disability insurance companies how to not pay benefits to people, that people need to be treated with cognitive behavior therapy or exercise therapy or some sort of rehabilitation program in order to go back to work. There is no evidence that these treatments get anybody back to work, and in fact, the evidence from PACE suggests that they don't. However, they did not include this in their form. I've raised all these issues with them, and in various venues, including a response to my initial investigation. My initial investigation was a 15,000-word piece on virology blog in October 2015. So they gave various answers to all my complaints. So first they said, we told the journals about our conflicts of interest. A bullshit response, obviously. The Declaration of Helsinki was not written to protect journal editors or journal readers. It was written to protect participants. It is completely irrelevant that you disclosed your conflicts of interest with disability insurance companies to the Lancet and to the journals if you didn't tell your patients. The second one is that insurance companies were not involved in the study. Again, this is ridiculous. Insurance companies did not fund the study, but as everybody knows, that's not the definition of, that's one kind of conflict of interest. But conflict of interest is a fairly broad concept, and institutional affiliations of the authors, which was declared, and any possible conflicts of interest is a very broad thing. If you've been getting money from disability insurance companies and you're already actively telling them that the therapies you're investigating in your trial are actually working, then that's a conflict of interest because you obviously have a very big vested interest in your trial working. Otherwise, your career is screwed because you've been doing this thing for 20 years. So that's another bullshit response. Only 3 of our investigators had any work for insurance companies. Well, first of all, there were 4. And second of all, so what? What's the problem? Then you disclose 3 of them. It doesn't, these answers are just ridiculous. And this is the way they answer all the concerns. I'm sorry, I'm getting a little agitated because I just get very upset when I talk about this because I'm a reporter. We were trained, if something's peer reviewed, you can sort of be sure that, relatively sure that it's actually okay and that's the basis on which we report on things. This just totally doesn't work. So this has all really been a shock to me, this whole investigation. So another thing they did was they published participant newsletters. And in December 2008, when they still had 200 people that they were assessing in the trial, they published a newsletter with not only greetings from 10 Downing Street about what a wonderful thing it was. Of course, it was Gordon Brown then, so maybe people wouldn't have paid attention. But a greeting from 10 Downing Street about how great the trial was, a half a dozen testimonials about how wonderful the treatment was. You can't do this. You can't do this in science. And then they also included an article about the new NICE guidelines, and they basically said this. So, okay, they're already telling participants that these treatments are working, that this has been determined to work based on the best available evidence, okay? So these are treatments, these are patients in the trial. So again, this is shocking. And I showed this to one of my colleagues at Berkeley, a biostatistician, the testimonials, and he said, you mean he was like so perplexed. He said, they published this during the trial? And I said, yeah. And he said, well, I guess there's no prohibition against publishing wonderful participant testimonials during a trial because nobody ever actually occurred to anybody that somebody would try to do such a thing in their trial. So, in that sense, again, they have no responses. The treatment arms were not mentioned in testimonials, so there could have been no bias. Now, this is shocking because from the testimonies, you can tell that they were in the active treatment arms and not in the passive treatment arms. They claim that they didn't mention which treatment arm they were in the testimonials. But the point is, you can't influence everybody in your trial in a positive direction as well. That's also bias. I mean, it's just preposterous. Then they also said the article about NICE mentioned activity management, which was the third treatment of the trial, so there couldn't have been any bias. Again, the third treatment of the trial, the intervention of the trial that they call activity management, was actually APT, adaptive pacing therapy. So they were measuring their 2 active therapies against what they claimed was an operationalization of pacing that patients use. So they call that adaptive pacing therapy, and it was developed just for the PACE trial. So there's no possible way that activity management can be considered the third arm of the trial. It is not. This is a lie. Just a lie. It's unbelievable that they would even say such a thing. Yes, as I said, an unbelievably bullshit response. Outcome switching. Okay, so this is really an unbelievable thing. Now, if my Norwegian colleagues were doing their research right, they would have changed all their outcome measures when they realized that they would have better results if they could do that. You could have changed your outcome measures and reported better results. That's what they did. I'm not going to go through all of them. They changed their primary outcomes, but this is the one that's most shocking. So the SF-36, which was referred to earlier, the physical function score, to get into the trial, you needed so you needed a 65 out of 100 to get into the trial. 100 is perfect. Most normal people score 95 to 100. 0 is you're just comatose. They started off at 85 as the recovery threshold for this outcome. They have 4 recovery measures. 4 measures. To be considered recovered, you have to pass 4 different criteria. So this was one of them. So 85 out of 100 was the initial threshold for that, and then they lowered it to 60 when the entry to the trial was 65. So basically, you could get worse in the trial and still be counted as recovered on that measure. It's like bizarre. It's like from outer space. 13% of the participants were either within normal range, which is what they called it in the Lancet paper, or recovered on that threshold, as they called it in a paper 2 years later. So this is, any paper with this anomaly has to be rejected and, retracted. There's no question. It's not even debatable. What are their answers? First answer was we changed our outcome measures before seeing the results, so they were pre-specified. This is totally ridiculous. Again, it's if you say that, what they did is essentially this. They said being tall is 5'10". Then they weren't getting enough tall people in their trial, so they say being tall is 5'8". So of course you're going to have more tall people in your trial if you say tall, if you redefine it downward. So it doesn't take, it's not a rocket scientist or a statistician to know that if you redefine your outcomes downward, you're going to have more people. So it doesn't matter if you pre-specified it or not. If you had a specification and then you lowered it, obviously more people will fill that criteria. So this makes no sense. Then this one is my favorite. It doesn't matter that people who were within normal range were recovered on key variables because we have other recovery measures as well. Now, anybody trying to do a trial in cancer research or in any actual thing that people recognize as a disease coming up with this kind of explanation for why people were recovered at baseline in their trial would just be laughed out of the academy and thrown out of their university position. This is totally, totally preposterous. And so I was very naive. I thought when I first did this, I'd do a 15,000 word investigation. Patients had already pointed these things out, but I was able to raise it to a higher scientific level. I was able to get other academics involved who had never heard of this trial. So I thought you point that out and game over. I mean, a study like that cannot survive. However, the Lancet has stood behind it. Psychological Medicine, which covered the recovery paper, has stood behind it. It's just really shocking, and it shows that the entire UK medical establishment, as far as I'm concerned, is completely screwed up. And really, as I say, the emperor has no clothes. It's just ridiculous. I don't see how anybody stands behind it. So I'm going to mention just one other thing, the PLOS-1 study. So PLOS-1 study was the study that allowed them to claim that that these treatments were cost effective. And they've run with that forever since the trials first came out, that these are cost effective treatments. Now, when they assessed cost of, so basically this paper, this PLOS-1 paper contains a really big lie. It's just a lie. It's this statement. So what they did was they had different ways of measuring what they called informal care. So that's the unpaid care that everybody gets from family and so on, right? So they measured it 3 different ways. They assessed it at the average, reasonably high wage of a healthcare worker. They assessed it at minimum wage. And they assessed it at the wage which actually gets paid, which is nothing, because that's what people do. So basically, when they had 3 different alternatives, and you need to do something called sensitivity analyses that show whether if you change your assumptions, that actually changes the outcomes. So they made the claim here that no matter how we measured this informal care, sensitivity analyses showed that it made no difference. So this is just a lie. Because as Tom Kinlan, my buddy, patient in Dublin, and one other patient pointed out, it just wasn't true. And here in this, again, this is a bad PowerPoint because it's so many words, but here. If a smaller unit cost for informal care, if informal care is used, such as the minimum wage rate, then there would remain a saving in informal care costs in favor of CBT, but this would clearly be less than in the base case used in the paper. If 0 value for informal care, which as we know is the main value paid because nobody gets paid for caring for their family members, if 0 value is used, then the costs are based entirely on health social care, which were highest for CBT, GEP, and lost employment. So basically, he's saying the statement in the paper is wrong. Yes, it's true, you're right that if you use these other assumptions, you get different rates. Now, he doesn't say we have to retract the paper or we have to correct that. He says this, he gives other reasons for why they valued it that way. We valued it that way because we're devaluing the care that's given if we value it. Well, that's ridiculous because 1, people aren't getting paid. 2, you introduced a lie in your paper and you said it's cost effective no matter how you measure it. That is just a lie. And I've tried to point this out to PLOS-1. They haven't responded. I did organize an open letter to PLOS-1 about this problem. They haven't responded. They got caught up in a whole other issue relating to James Coyne's quest for the data for the PLOS-1 paper. My point is you don't need the data to document that they lied and that the paper is inaccurate and needs to be corrected or retracted and that, in fact, these things are not cost effective if you look at the regular way people are receiving care. So here are my conclusions. PACE is utter nonsense, completely meaningless bullshit. The manipulations, lack of informed consent, and other issues lead to conclusion that this is research misconduct according to any normal guidelines. So let me just make this explicit. If you know that 13% of your participants are recovered on one of your two primary outcomes at baseline, and you do not include that in your study, that I would submit is research misconduct. There is no way that is not research misconduct. It is obviously relevant information. It obviously is very important for assessing your conclusions. And to leave it out, I would argue, is research misconduct. To not have informed consent is research misconduct. They have no ethical right to publish any of their data. Any of their data. They wasted £5 million, not just because of bad design, but because they did not obtain proper informed consent. So I've been arguing, and nobody seems to pay attention to this, the Lancet or nobody, that they do not have informed consent. They have no legitimate defenses. Their defenses, they keep saying they've responded to all the questions, but they haven't. They give non-answers. They give bullshit answers. This is just my opinion. They should be ashamed of themselves, but they're not. And I have no doubt that if I were wrong, they'd be suing me. I've been saying the same things for a year and a half, and I haven't seen a lawsuit coming my way. Their reputations are at stake. And apart from the great research that's going on, which will damage their reputations, I've done a pretty good job of damaging their reputations, at least more in the US probably than here. I have no doubt that Esther Crawley does believe that I have libeled her. I think they have a very difficult time separating out opinions they don't like from libelous charges. However, I'm sure they've consulted with lawyers, and I would imagine that the lawyers have said to them, you don't have a case, otherwise they would have sued me. They haven't sued me yet. And that's it. And in my redoing of my thing, I put my crowdfunding campaign at the end, just to make a personal pitch for myself. I've done all this work on my own dime. I've come to London several times, doing research and whatever. I did one story where I got paid, but all the other stuff was on my own. No financial backing, no academic support from my institution, but it was not an academic project. It was my own personal project. My academic position's ending for reasons that have to do with Berkeley finances. So that was my income that allowed me to do this. So I'm trying to replace that income with crowdfunding. And so I started my campaign. That's about $60,000 is my salary and benefits from Berkeley. And so far I've raised about 25% of that. But the first day was a big shot, and then it slowed down. So I'm just appealing to you to please help me continue to do this work, because I'm really, I'm not doing it for a family member. It's been a fascinating intellectual thing, but I've also obviously talked to a lot of patients, and I'm really committed that this PACE stuff has to be gotten rid of, and the research, that will really help the research go forward. So, I'm doing this because it's interesting to me, but I'm also doing it for all of you, so I hope I can count on some support. And also, I just really wanted to thank Joan and Sally and everybody who organized this, and I apologize for a slight disorganized presentation, but that's what it is. So thanks very much.
I have been with this work for merely 6 months. I'm a public health consultant with a public health agency, and in that sense, from a clinical perspective, I'm a jack of all trades and master of none. The ME work, I suppose, came my way because I had been working with the patient-client council for the best part of 2 years following the publication of the Painful Truth Report in 2014. And having investigated the level of pain management and other support service provision in Northern Ireland, and finding it somewhat wanting, I had set up the Regional Pain Forum, which is an informal network of service providers and service users. And we endeavour to improve pain management services and other related services for people here in Northern Ireland. We have great plans. They are very well developed, and we are just waiting for the political and financial situation to allow us to implement some of the work we have undertaken. As part of that, we developed a fibromyalgia pathway, and you might have noticed the organization running today's event is Hope4ME and fibromyalgia. So it was really from that perspective that I got to meet some of the people here in this room today. That was in 2016, and late in 2016 I met with some people who have been supporting this work for many, many years. And shortly after that, in January 2017, I met with people that consider themselves stakeholders in the efforts to improve services for people with ME. That was shortly after, followed by a smaller working group where we really picked up on work that has been ongoing for years in trying to get a medical lead for services for patients with ME here in Northern Ireland. And while much effort had gone in previously, those endeavours had failed, and it was about really bringing a new impetus to that work. So in February this year we met and we looked at the work that had been done before and made some changes, and essentially developed a draft job specification for a clinician that could lead the services here in Northern Ireland. And we sent that to our HR colleagues, very importantly, in March. Got it back in April, and made some final changes and are now waiting for the final version. Seems all fairly straightforward. It of course never is, and you have to do a lot of work sort of between times to keep the show running. So this being May 2017, the plan is that we will meet with the medical directors of all the health and social care trusts in September. Unfortunately, they don't have a meeting until then, so there's nothing we can do about that, and get their opinion on the proposal. And the key points of the proposal now are that we've increased the time commitment for the post from 0.3 sessions, or 0.3 whole-time equivalent to 0.5. That means a half-time job in a week. The post doesn't need to be held by one person. It can be a number of people sharing, which might give us a wider range of expertise and also better regional spread, but that's open for discussion. The post can be located anywhere in Northern Ireland. That's not predetermined, but depends on who's interested and what works for everyone. And it's no longer a consultant of a particular specialty. We heard earlier, ME doesn't really belong to any particular college. It can be a suitably experienced medic, and that could include a GP with specialist experience and interests. And that obviously opens it up to a wider range of people. So we're cautiously positive that will be successful this time round. Come sort of final agreement in September 2017, obviously we're not there yet. The post needs to be advertised, and I would like that to be in the BMJ, which I think is probably a very widely read general medical journal that should have a broad reach globally, not just places near us. Then comes the shortlisting. Then we need to interview. Some of our service users have already had interview training, which is great because we want to have a very inclusive interview panel. Then we need to recruit the persons. They have to accept the post, and we need to employ them, or him or her. So if people ask me how long will all of this take, well, I don't think it'll be this side of Christmas, unfortunately, but at least I think we have a pathway that looks as if it might be successful. So having listened to very interesting presentations today, I'm really pleased to say that thanks to the efforts of everyone that has contributed to the work, I don't think we have left anything uncovered that needs to be part of this job. First and foremost, there is the management, the diagnosis, the support, the treatment of patients, but clinical leadership also for the services that we already have in Northern Ireland, which are currently provided by GPs, by general medical consultants, by a whole range of therapists, but without that clearly identifiable individual that's in the driving seat for service improvement and development. A key part of the role will be education, training and teaching of others, not just medics, but allied health professionals, nurses, managers, the public, any of the above. And quite excitingly, we have seen some really innovative and interesting research pieces that are coming to fruition. We would hope that the person that gets the post, or the people that do get the post, will contribute to that in collaboration with the Centre of Excellence in the UK, or several, or beyond the UK, depending on what the opportunities are. But purely for governance reasons, we have established links with an existing Centre of Excellence in the UK to ensure that whoever comes to this work is not on their own, because it is, I think, at this point in time, a fairly unique position that can be very exciting and very satisfying. But single-handed practice is not a good thing in terms of I think anybody's work, and we want to ensure that the people that do take on this leadership role will be supported. And one key principle for which I really wanted to show the picture that hasn't shown up, it was a photograph of us launching the fibromyalgia pathway in September last year, which was a collaborative effort with service users and service providers. That is really an underpinning principle of the work going forward, one that I think will be tested at interview, provided that we have people to interview, which we sincerely hope we will. And that's really all I have to say. I hope that wasn't too strenuous. After all that, certainly I found very interesting, but also quite challenging to take in this afternoon. And I'll leave you with that and the experts for further questions.